So, welcome everybody this evening to our second talk by Philip Graves. Philip Graves is an independent scholar of the history of astrology and a dedicated astrological librarian and archivist. He's previously lectured on historical astrological topics for 4 international conferences. He's had 42 historically focused essays published in Infinity Astrological Magazine, The Mountain Astrologer, the Astrological Journal, and the Career Astrologer. So tonight we're doing early developments towards modern psychological astrology, 1842 to 1960. So if you'd like to welcome Philip this evening.
Thank you very much, Mary. And to be precise, this is the second lecture on. And do we want to answer Janet's question quickly before we begin? Can somebody unmute Janet?
Let me check. Yes, I invite Janet unmute herself. Janet, you can try unmute yourself. Yeah.
I think you've got the wrong Janet. I don't.
Oh, I get, but I saw the
rise.
I think the rising hand. That's why. Okay.
Okay. If there aren't any questions, we can just proceed. That's fine.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if you do the raise hand, it signals that you want to ask a question, just for future
Okay.
reference.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay.
okay, we shall proceed. So, to be precise, this is the second instalment of early developments towards modern psychological astrology, 1842 to 1960. And in this case, we're going to take 20 sources between 1914 and 1935. So before we get into sharing all the slides, actually, no, I'm going to start screen sharing now, and let's go for entire screen share, and I am then going to start the slideshow. And can somebody just please give a nod that that's working correctly?
All super duper, Philip.
Excellent.
No problems.
Okay, so. It seems to have left it, so I'll just do it again. Sorry, that's fine. Right. So we'll go straight away to the introduction. Excuse me, it seems to be doing the. Wait a moment. Sorry, it was on the wrong slide. Now I will start the slideshow again. That's better. That's the first screen. So this is lecture 2, 9th May 2026, Psychological Astrology before Dane, Rudhyar, an examination of 20 primary sources from 1914 to 1935. In the first talk in this series, in mid-March, I gave an analytical overview of the prevalence of Western astrological books containing psychologically indicative keywords in their titles in 3 major European languages up to the year 1960, then closely examined 15 sources of relevance published between 1863 and 1913 in chronological order. From this examination, it was demonstrated, firstly, that astrologers have been motivated to advance more psychological readings than allowed for by received astrological tradition of every element of the birth chart from the mid-1870s onwards, independently of any influence by renowned psychologists. Secondly, that this trend took shape in a particularly striking form in American esoteric thinker Hiram Butler's radically reformist astrological doctrine of solar biology, as introduced in his book of the same name in 1887, which in turn engendered the emerging genre of full-length books dedicated exclusively to the psychological reading of the sun signs from 1894 onwards. And thirdly, that by 1908, one of France's most influential astrologers of the early 20th century, Paul Chouinard, had specifically advocated for the merging of astrology with modern psychology arguing that it would be beneficial to both disciplines, each of which he felt lacked due rigor in isolation from the other. All of these trends predated the rise to prominence of Carl Jung in academic psychology and the appearance of his most celebrated and ultimately influential texts on psychology, even in the original German, comprehensively disproving the misguided received historical narrative that his influence was either the initial inspiration for or at the origin of the development of modern psychological astrology. At the same time, the demonstrated timeline for the emergence of modern psychological sun sign astrology in the United States by 1894 categorically disproved the revisionist 21st century historical narrative that falsely attributes its origins to the influence of Alan Leo, who had not even begun writing his first book by then. In this second talk, we shall take the timeline forward from 1914 to 1935, a period of rich developments in new astrological literature, and one in which the trend towards modern psychological astrology was further solidified. Stopping today's talk after 1935 is designed to ensure a clear intellectual demarcation between psychological astrology before Dane Rudhyar and the further development of psychological astrology under the influence of his book, The Astrology of Personality, as first published in 1936, demonstrating how far it had developed independently of him and before he added his voice to the literature in any significant measure. Source 1, Cepharial. Phrenoscopy, being a synthetic system of astrophrenology, the key to human character, 1914. Cepharial, although he wrote mostly about astrology, had varied interests within the divinatory arts, as well as being a theosophist. His book Phrenoscopy, one of several of his works that were published by Falsham, one of the leading British astrological publishers since the mid-1880s, is perhaps his most peculiar work to have been published, in that it sought to rehabilitate the already obsolescent doctrine of phrenology that had been briefly popular in the mid-19th century by presenting it with an astrological overlay. The problem with phrenology is that it has generally been recognized as a pseudoscience following advances in neuroscience. It speculatively attributed types of mental activity to particular physical areas of the brain, to each of which Cepharial gives governance by one of the classically known planets in this book. Despite being arguably of only historical interest today, this book is relevant here as an example of how the movement within astrology towards the use of the birth chart to read character was supported by the popularity of other character reading systems that had proliferated and flourished during the 19th century, chiefly ones based on physical signs, phrenology being a prime example. The fact that some astrologers from that time onwards also studied these systems can reasonably be held up as a partial cause of the move towards astrology placing more of a psychological focus on the birth chart. We saw a similar case in the first talk with Cairo, the celebrated society palmist turned astrologer. Besides, Cepharial was by no means the first astrologer to specifically attempt to integrate phrenology with astrology. In 1836, J.T. Hackett, in his book The Student's Assistant in Astronomy and Astrology, had included a 49-page theoretical discourse on the harmony of astrology with both phrenology and physiognomy. In 1842, W.J. Simonite reprised this theme in his serialized essay, The Harmony of Astrology and Phrenology, within his magazine, The Scientific and Literary Messenger. And by 1849, Simonite was advertising for sale a manuscript called Astrophrenology, within the first edition of his book, The Celestial Philosopher, circa 1849. That manuscript was partly posthumously serialized in the pages of Modern Astrology magazine starting in January 1914, coincidentally or otherwise the same year that Safarial's book was published. There was also a persistent current of astrophrenological thinking in the UK after 1850 in the work of John Ackroyd, which spread to the USA, where it was championed by Luke Dennis Brufton in the 1860s and was again taken up by American astrologer Frank Earl Ormsby in the 1890s. In his preface, Safarial expressly acknowledges the limitations of both astrology and phrenology when it comes to understanding the human mind, writing, page 5, all recondite problems concerning the ultimate nature of mind, which properly belong to the domain of psychology and philosophy, have been set aside. And in effect, I have endeavoured to present a method by which the complexities of character reading are reduced to their simplest equation. Having said that, he does then offer this definition of character, pages 9 to 10. Character, as we know it, is the partial expression of the soul or individual through the medium of the personality. The individual is the imperishable entity, that which cannot be destroyed, as the name suggests. The personality, on the other hand, is that physical sheath or envelope through which the individual is required to express itself through this plane of existence. Hence the name persona, a mask. What we know of the individual is only so much as, under the stimulus of circumstances, is capable of expressing itself through the personality. Modern psychology and mental science have taught us that the submerged self, which probably constitutes 2/3 of the floating continent of mind, is a storehouse of memories and a fountain of faculty of which we only get glimpses under peculiar conditions. Having thus signalled his awareness of modern psychological theories of the subconscious, Safarial proceeds to imply that astrology has always taught along similar lines. Page 9. This indeed is what we might have been led to expect had we pursued our studies along the lines already laid down for us by the ancients, for we should then inevitably have learned to discern between the individual and the personal, between inherent aptitude and expressed function. The implication of this observation is that modern psychology, with its theory of the subconscious, is entirely compatible with traditional astrology. Safarial's manifest readiness to accept modern psychological theory and to absorb it into the understanding of astrological principles would seem to exemplify the preparedness of astrologers of his day to align astrology more closely with psychology than ever before, even though he emerges as having been on the wrong side of scientific history with his foray into phrenology as a tool to this end. If we studiously disregard the phrenological material in the book, we can still find valuable insights into the author's attempts to link the elements of astrology to faculties of mind and psychological principles. For example, he connects moon to the natural propensities which are at the root of all human character, Mercury to the rational faculties, Neptune with the faculty of prevision, and Uranus to the synthetic faculty of mind. But Safarial also links the zodiac signs to mental faculties and psychological tendencies. Aries to executiveness, Taurus to acquisitiveness, Gemini to inquisitiveness, Cancer to tenacity, Leo to command, Virgo to preservation, Libra to adjustment, Scorpio to analysis, Sagittarius to apprehension of that which is distant in time or place, Capricorn to ambition, Aquarius to combination, and Pisces to intuition. This keyword-based methodology, limited though it may be, testifies to Safarial's attempts by 1914 to develop a coherent system of psychological astrology, and one that, although primitive, is arguably somewhat more perspicacious than the esoterically minded the esoterically admired equivalent attempts of his contemporary Alan Leo. Source 2. Conrad Moricon. Les interprètes essais de classement psychologique d'après les correspondances planétaires, 1919. Conrad Moricon was a relatively peripheral figure in the French astrological scene of the early 20th century. He penned 3 fairly short astrological books, but was not one of the more oft-cited authors referenced by other French astrologers. However, he has a more indirect and unfortunate claim to fame in American literary circles on account of having been portrayed as a devil by his erstwhile friend Henry Miller in Miller's 1956 book A Devil in Paradise. The extended title of Moricon's 1919 book Les Interprètes directly evidences a desire on his part to integrate astrology with psychology. The subtitle promises an attempt at psychological classification according to planetary correspondences. In practice, however, this is not a highbrow intellectual work like the book of 1908 that we have previously reviewed by Paul Joasnar. It is a simple 72-page primer of the psychological traits of the 12 natal sun signs, expressed as a mixed string of keywords and relatively short phrases and observations, but with each whole sign reading then further divided into 3 separate decan readings. These decan readings appear to be based on the Chaldean face rulers. Thus, for instance, the respective decans of Aries are ruled by Mars, Sun, and Venus, but there is a notable mistake in the reading for the 3rd decan of Taurus, with the glyph for Jupiter printed when it should be Saturn. Another quirk is that the readings for the decans of Gemini are incomplete, with only the 2nd decan of 3 separately delineated. In practice, what Moricon has achieved with this book is not that far removed from what Phelps did in Our Astrological Birthday book in 1903, as discussed in the first of these talks. Albeit, Moricon has adhered to a greater degree to a traditional division of the zodiac signs into decans, whereas Phelps subdivided each sign into arbitrary units of varying numbers of days. It may be a simplistic and incomplete one, and the use of short phrases without complete sentences or other supporting context makes the author's meaning in places obscure, but Moricon's work is still a notable early attempt to apply the language of psychological classification to the delineation of the natal sun in what should have been 36 separate decan readings, one that heralds astrologers' growing interest in applying the language of psychological types to astrological interpretation. Source 3. Elsbeth Ebertin. Historische und zeitgenössische Charakterbilder nach Handschrift, Bild, Nativität und Lebenswerken bedeutender Denker und Dichter, 1921. The second German language work we shall look at comes from the pen of one of the leading German astrologers of the early 20th century, Elsbeth Ebertin, who was famed in her time for her annual astrological almanacs with their mundane astrological forecasts, and wrote extensively on both astrology and graphology, mostly in isolation from each other, but in this case together as part of the same book. The publication in 1921 of a book in a language other than English that seeks to combine character readings from at least 2 separate disciplines adds weight to the theory that the popularity of non-astrological divinatory tools for character reading since the 19th century directly impacted the development of astrology in the same direction, corroborating the testimonies already established by the books we looked at earlier by Cairo and Safariel, and showing that the effect was not unique to English-speaking astrological cultures. Unlike Cairo's and Safariel's aforementioned works, this book by Elsbeth Ebertin is not a textbook. Rather, it's a compendium of her lengthy case studies of 7 famous thinkers and writers whose life's work was already known: Dante Alighieri, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, Friedrich Nietzsche, August Strindberg, Oscar Wilde, Austrian novelist Gustave Meyrink, and Austrian art critic Joseph August Lux. In each case, Frau Ebertin, who was the mother of Reinhold and raised him into the practice of astrology, uses a combination of handwriting analysis and astrological analysis to inform the reader's understanding of the character of the famous individual, while also giving an account of their life and achievements. It may not be sophisticated textbook psychology, but it is a psychological application of astrology as it seeks to assist in the understanding of the character of famous people. Source 4, Laurel Miller, Astropsychology, 1922. This is the only known book on astrology by the little documented Laurel Miller, who was not recorded in the late James Herschel Holden's Biographical Dictionary of Western Astrologers, but who also authored a book called Kabbalistic Numerology. Laurel being a unisex name, we cannot be sure of their gender, although it is nearly always given to girls, which, if so in this case, would make this writer one of the earlier woman astrologers to have had a book published in the USA, certainly predating Evangeline Adams by several years in that regard. For present purposes, let us presume Laurel Miller was indeed a woman. In this light, it is perhaps all the more impressive that this is also the first known English language astrology book by any author to have included the word psychology in its very title. It was published by the Metaphysical Publishing Company of New York, which had previously published prominent American astrologer John Hazelrig's first book in 1900. In practice, there is considerable obtuse esoteric philosophy in this book by Miller, in common with the work of Hazelrig, raising the question of whether or not they were direct mutual associates. There is also some mystical prophesying on the future of humanity. The esoteric philosophy and mysticism are blended in with elements of the language of psychology, leaving us with a hybrid work that would probably have made more sense in its day to those conversant with theosophy than to those with a background in the academic study of psychology. Such books have become harder to fathom for most of today's moderns, but for its time it was far from being alone in its heavy leaning on esotericism, as we have seen in the case of Alan Lear's book Esoteric Astrology, for example. Passing over the esoteric passages while searching the book, we can find scattered rudiments of a theory of astrological psychology as promised by the title. For instance, the sun is said to correspond to the faculty of intuition, the moon to that of reason, Mercury to the sense of touch, Venus to hearing, Mars to acquisitiveness, Jupiter to perception, Saturn to smell, Uranus to sight, and Neptune to what is described as interior hearing. The second half of the book expounds an elementary theory of sun sign synastry that has much in common with the much later ideas of Linda Goodman, in assigning tendencies towards relative degrees of compatibility and either sympathy or antipathy based on the positional relationship of the signs to each other within the zodiac, with sign pairings in trine relationship to each other portrayed as tending towards mutual sympathy, and those in square relationship to each other as tending towards mutual antipathy, exactly as portrayed by Goodman in her best-selling book Love Signs 56 years later. It amounts to a simplified astrological theory of variable relationship psychology. Towards the end, a short chapter headed Self-Esteem, Ambition and Aggressiveness assesses the relative degrees of influence in these directions among the different signs and planets as a general rule. It feels a pity that this approach was not extended to other psychological qualities, and that the book was not thus systematized into what could have become a more complete and cohesive theory of astropsychology if the author had taken it further. In its published form, it resembles more a mere glimpse of the author's ideas in that direction that were sadly held back from their fullest possible exposition. Source 5, Oscar H. Schmitz, Der Geist der Astrologie, 1922. This lengthy book of 374 pages, first published by Georg Müller of München or Munich in 1922, was significant in bringing to the forefront the drive among German-speaking astrologers to develop a psychological astrology. It is internally divided into two nominal books, of which the first is headed Astrologie als Erfahrungswissenschaft, Astrology as an Empirical Science, and the second is headed Astropsychologie, Astropsychology. We shall pass over the first book for present purposes as it is less directly relevant. 3 chapters into Book 2, in a footnote to page 218, the author states as his intention to systematically compile what he here calls psychoastrologia, so that its sense shines through. He declares that much of his work builds on the writings of the French occultist F. Charles Bachelet in his book Les Génies Planétaires, which he holds as containing the most profound insights that modern astrology has thus far produced on astropsychology. Bachelet's book was published the year before 1921. Schmitz lays no claim to originality. He was not a very experienced astrologer, having first been introduced to the subject by a baroness in 1917, before learning it further from Friedrich Schwickert, starting in 1918, just 4 years before the publication of his book. And he acknowledges his role as being just that of a compiler. But it is historically significant that he adopted a label for the kind of astrology he was presenting that directly linked it to psychology. In practice, the content of this second internal book is chiefly limited to extended discussions of the elements of natal astrology in their individual essences. It begins with an exposition of the 12 houses and continues with lengthy sections exploring the principles connected with each of the classical planets in turn, in combination with the zodiac signs in which they have been traditionally granted their domiciles, as well as any modern planets now also associated with one of those signs. Thus, in turn, we find discussions of 1. The Sun and Leo, 2. Saturn, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Uranus, 3. Jupiter, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Neptune, 4. Mars, Aries, and Scorpio, 5. Venus, Libra, and Taurus, 6. Mercury, Gemini, and Virgo, and 7. The Moon and Cancer. It is noteworthy this is not a book of delineations of astrological placements, but rather one attempting to define and elucidate the psychological essence of each astrological element. Despite its theoretical approach, it was a market success, enjoying repeated reprints and reaching 14,000 copies printed by 1937, which was 6 years after the author's death in 1931. Jennifer Zart gives a thorough account of Schmitz's approach to astrology in her PhD thesis, The Astrological Imaginary in Early 20th Century German Culture, 2012, recording that his attraction to taking a psychological approach to astrology was significantly born of his earlier reading of a famous 19th century French palmistry text from 1859 by Adolphe de Barrol, Chiromancie nouvelle, les mystères de la main révélés et expliqués. This contextualizes Schmitz as yet another example of astrologers of this period who were attracted to the use of astrology for character reading purposes by the like functions of other popular divinatory disciplines. Schmitz, who was born in 1873, subsequently wrote a book entitled Psychanalyse und Yoga, which was published in 1923 and aimed even more ambitiously, as the title suggests, to synthesize Eastern yoga with Western psychoanalysis. From 1926, Schmitz studied directly under Carl Jung, with the result that in 1928 he became a working psychoanalyst himself. This suggests with hindsight that he was already persuaded of the value of modern psychology, and perhaps Jungian psychology in particular, when he wrote Der Geist der Astrologie, although he was yet to formally study it. James Herschel Holden implies that Schmitz had first met Jung in person in Zurich not long after the First World War, which could have been the stimulus that pushed him onto this life trajectory. If he had already been a trained Jungian psychoanalyst when he wrote this book, it is tempting to think that it would have approached the integration of astrology with psychology at a deeper level than it did, but it was still a work that helped to give impetus to the movement towards the development of modern psychological astrology, and exemplifies the fact that German thinkers had joined French ones in advocating for this by the early 1920s. And it can reasonably be argued that Schmitz's lengthy multi-page psychologically oriented descriptions of each of 7 astrological principles, combining planets and associated signs, anticipated the much later writing style of Dane Rudhyar on similar themes, as well as the extended narrative treatments of astrological factors in the light of psychological archetypes that would ultimately be found in the work of Liz Green and similarly minded psychological astrologers from the 1970s onwards. Source 6. Charles Carter, A Concise Encyclopedia of Psychological Astrology, together with observations on the astrological characteristics of about 50 diseases, and an introductory essay on the zodiacal signs from the standpoint of biology and psychology, 1924. In 1924, just 2 years after Laurel Miller's Astropsychology was published in the USA, Charles Carter's Concise Encyclopedia of Psychological Astrology was published by Failsham in the UK. This was the first book by Carter, who would become one of the UK's most sustainedly influential 20th century astrological theorists, and would ultimately author about 10 other original books and booklets on astrology. With effect from the expanded second edition of 1926, the word concise was dropped from the title, but here we shall review the first edition. Carter begins his foreword, page 5, which is dated 1923, by referencing the language of character that we have repeatedly seen used by his forebears in outlining the primary purpose of the book, with its secondary one being an investigation of natal indications of medical conditions. This work is an attempt to produce a useful astrological encyclopedia of character and, as far as data permit, of disease. Towards the end of the foreword, Carter expressly states, page 7, that he has from time to time referred to the current terms of modern psychology, the connection of which with a work of this sort is sufficiently obvious. This turn of phrase bears close reflection. Carter has testified in effect that by 1923 it was obvious that there was a natural connection between modern psychology and astrology. There is no claim made by him to have pioneered the forging of such a connection. He speaks of it casually, with matter-of-fact dismissiveness, as though it would be immediately understood as a statement of the obvious by his astrological contemporaries. This testimony by Carter should not surprise us when we have observed the trend towards the astrological delineation of character in so many earlier works than his, although it does not sit well with received historical narratives placing a considerably later date of genesis upon psychological astrology. Following the foreword, we find an introductory essay upon the zodiacal signs from the standpoints of biology and psychology. Here, Carter gives psychological readings of the elements as groups and of the signs in isolation, not the sun signs, but the signs in their essence. For example, he summarizes the water signs as respectively representing the following principles: Cancer, self-preservation, prudence in action; Scorpio, self-discipline, strength to endure; Pisces, self-abnegation, resignation, mental and emotional adaptation. The rest of the volume is presented as a dictionary of psychological attributes and aptitudes, with the accompanying text elucidating the expressions themselves and suggesting corresponding astrological manifestations, which vary widely in their technical details, with some being planets, others signs, others placements of planets in signs and houses, and still others aspects between planets. This comprehensive approach to the elucidation of psychology in the light of astrology is perhaps the fullest expression yet published by 1924 of Raphael VI's suggestion in 1877, as discussed in the first talk, that all elements of the birth chart have some relationship to the mind. While most of the psychological keywords we see astrologically illuminated by Carter amount to commonplace English language terms, there are a few that belong to the technical vocabulary of modern psychology and psychiatry, such as egoism, introversion and extroversion, and morbid fears, phobias. The inclusion of the discussion of introversion and extroversion is perhaps the earliest evidence we have seen of a possible Jungian influence on the English language literature of psychological astrology, although given that the English translation of Jung's psychological types was first published in 1923, Carter's window of opportunity for factoring Jung's theory as set out in this book into his own encyclopedia published only a year later was a very narrow one, but the terms may have already been in some psychological use before this. Without referencing Jung or any other source, Carter defines the two terms thus, page 89. By these terms, the psychologist denotes two opposite tendencies, to one or other of which most people incline: A, to live subjectively or within the self; B, to focus the interests externally upon the world of reality and devote the energies towards acting upon and producing results in it. With regard to the astrological correlates of these tendencies to extroversion or introversion, Carter cautiously opines, pages 89 to 90, it is doubtful if a similar clear-cut division can be made astrologically, although obviously there is an analogy between these psychological tendencies and the classification of the signs as positive and negative. But upon close examination, we find that we can by no means apply this rigidly. Source 7. A Mental Specialist. L.K. Astrology in Relation to Mind and Character, 1925. The publication of this short book of 61 pages by Falsham, the very year after the first edition of Carter's concise Encyclopedia of Psychological Astrology, has the appearance of a developing trend when you consider their common theme, the title of this one reading almost as a paraphrase of that of Carter's book. The author gives their initials as LK, but their identity is not established in public records. We can, however, deduce from their words that they are a doctor or possibly a psychiatrist, as they avow, page 13, that they have had some rather unusual experiences with regard to patients of unsound mind. This professional identity could easily explain their preference for anonymity, since astrological analysis was not widely considered a respectable practice for practicing doctors by this point in time. In Chapter 2, The Cusps of the Horoscope, the author argues, page 15, for the primary but non-exclusive influence of the ascendant sign upon temperament, and further cites afflictions by malefics to the ascendant degree as a partial significator of mental disease, when corroborated by other indications. Chapter 3, headed Character, then argues for a direct relationship between the zodiac signs and character in these terms. Each sign has a clearly marked type or correspondence in human personality, but some signs are perhaps more marked than others where the mentality is concerned. On a technical level, the author takes a relatively traditional approach, having more in common with established authors of the 19th century, as shown, for instance, in the greater focus on ascendant signs than sun signs, and the bringing into the protocol for the judgment of the mental health considerations such as aspects to the ruling planet of the ascendant and aspects to Mercury. Chapter 5, The Unbalanced Mind, is a case study of a woman who had been repeatedly committed to a mental asylum. The author judges the combination of interplanetary aspects in her birth chart to account for her lack of mental equilibrium. It is superfluous to detail which aspects here, and sufficient to state that the author is using a full range of traditional astrological considerations to assess psychiatric illness, which goes beyond psychological astrology to the realm of what will be labelled 47 years later by Harry F. Darling and Ruth Hale Oliver in their 1972 work of that name as astropsychiatry. Chapter 6, An Unusual Case, details another asylum patient case study whose sudden breakdown into mental illness is linked to another configuration of natal planetary aspects that had lain dormant until triggered by a transient planetary aspect. Whether this was by direction or transit is not explicitly stated. Then in Chapter 7, Suicidal Tendencies, the author cites multiple sets of astrological indicators that coexisted in cases they had observed or researched, with suspicion being placed on a combination of interplanetary aspects, sign placements, and house placements when found together. This is anecdotal level astrological research, but what is important for our purposes is the documented realization that some astrologers who were also medical professionals working in a psychiatric capacity were actively investigating and authoring books upon astrological correspondences with cases of serious mental illness as early as 1925. Source 8, Paul Schwarzner. Essai de psychologie astrale accompagné d'un dictionnaire de psychologie astrale destiné à l'interprétation. 1925. 17 years after the publication of his original essay on astral psychology in 1908, Schwarzner, now writing under his real name instead of Paul Flombard, had published in Paris this full-length book of the same basic name, which extends to 172 pages. The extended part of the name further promises a dictionary of astral psychology designed for the interpretation of birth charts. In practice, this dictionary is only a brief appendix of 9 pages, but is laid out in a similar keyword-based fashion to Charles Carter's full-length one published in 1924, raising the question of whether Schwarzner had written it this way independently or was inspired by the appearance of Carter's book to add in this content as an afterthought before his book went to press. That Schwarzner had in fact devised this system independently of Carter is proven by the appearance of a more limited version of his dictionary in the expanded second edition of Schwarzner's book Langage Astral, as published in 1922, 2 years before Carter's concise encyclopedia. In his 1922 work, Schwarzner's Dictionnaire de psychologie astrale extends to just 5 pages of dense text and covers 53 keyword headings. For his 1925 book, he not only added at least 16 new keywords, but also extended and edited his existing statements of the astrological correspondences of those he had covered 3 years earlier. By 1925, Schwarzner's Dictionary of Astral Psychology consists of astrological readings of 69 mostly psychological topics. The keyword headings, not all of which are sufficiently different from the English words to require translation here, include amour-propre, self-esteem, circonspection, circumspection or wariness, dissimulation, dissemblance or secretiveness, égoïsme, franchise, frankness or candor, idéalisme, indépendance, inquiétude, anxiety, intuition, originalité, ouverture intellectuelle, intellectual openness, pessimisme, possession de soi-même, self-possession, prudence, caution, rancune, rancor or spitefulness, réalisme, and skepticism. In most cases, interplanetary aspects or the relative strength or weakness of particular planetary significators are cited as the correlates. Only rarely are zodiac sign placements invoked. In the preface to the book, page 1, Schwarzner expressly sets out his aim for the book as being to establish astrological correspondences exclusively in relation to human psychology. Je n'ai envisagé ici un fait de correspondance astrale que celles qui ont trait à psychologie humaine. He then frames his research approach in scientific terms linked to the relative frequency of occurrence of astrological placements in those who have a particular human faculty and those who do not. Dans les ciels de naissance, un aspect astral est dit correspondre à telle faculté humaine, en caractère ou en destinée, quand cet aspect se rencontre plus fréquemment chez les hommes doués de cette faculté que chez les autres individus. This is no surprise from the pen of Schwarzner, who had been advocating for the importance of statistical astrological research since about 1899, but his avowed application of that statistically led approach specifically to astrological research into character traits in 1925 stands out as decidedly modern and forward-thinking for the time, and reinforces his rightful historical portrayal as a forward-thinking intellectual innovator who was very much at the vanguard of the development of modern psychological astrology. After remarking, page 11, that contemporary scientific astrology is already able to prove the influence of the stars, Schwarzner further argues that given the fact that there is any kind of demonstrable connection between human beings and the stars, it is no longer permissible to deny the importance of that role in connection, to deny the importance of the role of that connection to psychology. Schwarzner renews his long-expressed criticisms of the limitations of modern psychology, arguing that it relies on arbitrary verbal classifications devised by psychologists who believe themselves qualified to judge questions without any study, pages 14 to 15, and without making the slightest effort to research the connections between different attributes. At the same time, Schwarzner decries official science for ruling out the influence of the stars on human matters a priori, and for forbidding scientists to even consider the matter. He opines that in many cases the relationship between two things can be verified, although in a great number of cases such relationships remain doubtful. Implicitly, he is again arguing that psychology could be founded more assuredly than it has been if connections were drawn up between observed human attributes and the configurations of the celestial bodies based on careful research, and allowing for only those connections that can be proven by such research. The main text is divided between 3 nominal books, of which the first is headed De la psychologie astrale, meaning on astral psychology. There is too much material within this section for us to cover it all within this talk, so suffice it to be known that within the 6 chapters of this first internal book, Schwarzner sets out a research methodology for establishing and verifying laws of astral influence, particularly in application to astral psychology. This material reprises the theoretical groundwork laid in his original Essai de psychologie astrale, as found at the back of his book from 1908 that we discussed in the first talk. The second internal book, then presents extended discussions of particular points of relevance to undertaking and interpreting research in this area. And the third and final one sets out principles for the practical interpretation of the birth chart in the light of such research, illustrated by 7 case studies. Source 9, Dr. Otto Kellner, Charakterkunde und Astrologie, die astrologische Typenlehre, mit vielen Abbildungen und Handschriftproben, 1927. The title of this book from 1927, which was published by the Astra Verlag of Leipzig and Dresden, has the ring of a thoroughly modern approach to psychological astrology, translating as character study and astrology, astrological typology. Kellner's preface begins as though by this time these terms are already in regular currency in German astrological circles. Zu den interessantesten Zweigen der astrologischen Forschung gehört die astrologischen Typenlehre oder Astropsychologie. This translates as, among the most interesting branches of astrological research is astrological typology or astropsychology. Kellner adds that among contemporary German authors in the field of astrology, Dr. Med F. Schwab and Lena Voss have made significant contributions to the foundations of astrological typology. In this regard, he cites Schwab's 1923 book Sternenmächte und Mensch and Voss's 1926 book Der Mensch und seine Götter. But neither of these was caught by my initial keyword searches shows that even the historical study I'm presenting to you today, though far-reaching by design, is less than comprehensive in its illustration of the early history of psychological astrology, because it is based on a selection of titles plucked from the vast ocean of modern astrological literature on the basis of a keyword filter. We can, however, be grateful that Kellner has cited their importance to the development of the field in his day just a few years later. Schwab's book is worthy of a brief diversion here. A significant work of over 200 pages, Der Mensch und seine Götter uses statistical methodology to analyze the distribution of the planetary and ascendant sign placements within several occupations, but also in clairvoyance, sufferers from hysteria and mental illness, and cases of suicide, placing some of its researches very much in the territory of astrological psychology. Of historical note to us is the chapter on the uses of astrology, page 196, in which Schwab declares that through astrology, psychology is deepened and is led to the solution of the key question of the human psyche. Schwab adds that the analysis of the psyche becomes fruitful only via the analysis of the cosmos. Thus, far from contending that astrology needs to be aligned more with psychology to make it more scientific, he is arguing that psychology itself is defective and needs to be informed by astrology to make it meaningful and useful, which gives his views common ground with those of Schwarzner. Schwab's book reached an expanded second edition in 1933 and is often cited by contemporaneous German astrologers, testifying to its popularity and renown. Kellner frames his new book as a follow-up study to his 1925 work Vom Ausdrucksgehalt der Handschrift on the expressive content of handwriting, and declares that after several years of research, he has concluded that astropsychology, provided that it considers not only the ascendant sign but also the sun sign, as well as secondary influences such as strongly placed planets and the presence of multiple planets in one sign, is as useful as the report of the graphologist or characterologist. In practice, Kellner seeks to demonstrate this by offering up graphological and characterological analyses of the same subjects whose nativities he analyzes to demonstrate the degree to which they tally. This approach contextualizes his work as another example of the ready transferability in the times between interest in character reading by other popular methods such as graphology and so-called characterology, and character reading by astrology. In this context, incidentally, Kellner is referring to schools of characterology based on the analysis of physical appearance and facial expression, which were popular in Germany in his day, and among these he leans primarily on the ideas of Karl Rudhyar. Another declared influence on Kellner's book is Schmitz's Der Geist der Astrologie, which we covered earlier. Like Schmitz, Kellner divides his book into two main parts, of which the second, in this case headed Typenlehre, is focused on astrological typology. The organization of Kellner's material on the psychology of the planets is little scattier than that of Schmitz, however, for we find the first chapter devoted to the Mars and Venus temperaments, the second to Mercury, the third to Jupiter, Sun, and Moon, and the fourth to Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. It is beyond our purposes today to analyze this material in depth. It is sufficient to note that it was another honest attempt to set out psychological archetypes of relevance to the planets and related signs. Source 10, Dr. Alfred Fankhauser, Astrologie als kosmische Psychologie, 1927. The title of this, the earliest of several popular astrological books by Swiss astrologer Alfred Fankhauser, which was published in Bern, literally means astrology as a cosmic psychology. In his foreword, the author admits to having encountered the subject for the first time as recently as 1924. After first receiving a gift of Oskar Schmitz's book, he struggled to make sense of it before finally feeling he understood astrology after reading the slightly earlier books of Hans Wolff, a prominent German astrological author of the early 1920s, whose work he describes as highly intellectual. Fankhauser declares his aim with the present work as being to advance a new direction of astrological thinking. In practice, the book is divided into 4 parts, of which the first, headed Kosmologisches, sets out the author's metaphysical philosophy, and the others teach natal astrology. Within the philosophical part of the book, we find Fankhauser linking modern psychoanalytical theories of the unconscious to the Freudian concept of the id and to the ancient cosmological concept of the macrocosm. In contrast, pages 6 to 7, in contrast to which he links the Freudian concept of the ego to individual human consciousness and the microcosm. With such connections in mind, he sets out to reinterpret astrology in the light of modern psychology, adding, page 20, Astrologie will Weisheit sein. Sie will das Innen im Einzelmenschen, sein kosmisches Verbundensein, aufdecken. This means that astrology wants to be wisdom. It wants to uncover the inner self of the individual and its cosmic connectedness. He later, pages 22 to 3, adds that the inner self is also the inner nature of the celestial bodies, and that this nature can be explored by people through looking into their own depths, the knowledge of which is a prerequisite for all astrology. Within part 2 of the book, headed Astrologische Elemente, a fairly full range of the traditional elements of natal astrology is covered, including the planets, the aspects, and the signs. Part 3, Horoscopia, is focused on the reading of the 12 astrological rising signs, which are referred to as types. And part 4, Deutung, is a word case study of the interpretation of a birth chart. Perhaps surprisingly, for a book expressly focused on astrology as psychology, the ascendant sign readings include both physical descriptions and lengthier explorations of mental attributes, which are expounded under the subheading Zalish. We even find a chapter on methods for astrological prediction, which outlines both primary and secondary directions. Overall, Fankhauser's book reads as a curious blend of the traditional and the modern, in keeping with his aim to make sense of the dogma of traditional astrology, such as the mirroring of the microcosm in the macrocosm, by reconciling it with the elements of the worldview of modern psychology. And there we will take a pause because that is our halfway point.
Thank you, Philip. Roy has now joined us as well. If you want to say hello, Roy, I don't know if you
Yeah,
can
just
hear us.
hello. I'm sorry
Yeah.
I was a little late. Things have got me chaotic at this end after what's been happening over the last few days. But wonderful to hear such a good group, see such a good group, and hear such great insight. Thank you very much for all coming.
We're
Thank
going to
you, Roy.
take a 10-minute break now. So if you need to have a dash off somewhere and get a drink, then do that. So we're going to reconvene in 10 minutes' time. Philip's going to do the second half of his talk, and then we're going to have questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and we can actually take questions during the break if anyone wants to, though it's not obligatory. Mary, you're muted. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, Pamela. Yes, we are recording it. Yes, it's the whole thing will be recorded. It will go onto our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it later, and then also you'll get a link for it. So no probs there. Don't worry. Charlotte, thank you very much for turning up.
Hi, Charlotte.
Philip,
Yes.
hi, sorry.
Hi,
This
Karen.
is a name I don't know. You were saying that Otto Kellner
Yeah,
leans on the ideas of Karl Hütter.
yeah.
Could you spell Hütter? Is that H-U umlaut?
Huter.
Right, okay.
He's a sort of big name in the German esoteric world. I think he also compiled an annual almanac, and it continued in his name for quite a few years, the 20th century, quite a few decades, in fact, though I don't have many of those because he's not kind of that well known as an astrologist so much as a characterologist, I
Right.
think.
So have you read all these books yourself in the original language?
I haven't read them all cover to cover. No, there's
No.
simply too much material here. So what I
Yes.
tend to do is to read on a case by case as needs basis for particular pieces of research.
Right. It's fascinating. It's invaluable, really.
Thank you. I'm glad you're finding it interesting. And by the way, I must apologize for my imperfect German pronunciation. I did only take German to the age of 16, and that was a long time ago now. So occasionally I will make mistakes with my German pronunciation, though I do my best.
Well, we're not judging you. We're just judging that the talk is fascinating. Right, cup of tea for me. And you should wet your whistle as well, Philip, shouldn't you?
I'm sorry, should I have a drink, you mean, or
You
what?
should, yes,
Okay,
yeah,
well, yes, I will take a little bit of water in a moment. Okay,
yes.
well, I'll be back in just a couple of minutes then, if you give me a couple of minutes, everybody, and we'll resume very soon.
So, Philip, when you're ready, part 2.
Right, welcome back, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen again. We'll get straight on with the next part. So we move on to source 11, Dr. Med Carl Günther Heimsoth, Charakterkonstellation mit besonderer Berücksichtigung der Gleichgeschlechtlichkeit, 1928. Carl Günther Heimsoth was a medically qualified practicing psychoanalyst as well as an astrologer, but in contrast to the anonymous author of Astrology in Relation to Mind and Character, he did not feel the need to conceal his identity when submitting for publication this book on astrology. At the same time, Charakterkonstellation is a much more conceptually advanced and demanding book than the earlier English language title, and demonstrates its author's considerable erudition in modern psychoanalytical theory. The title literally translates as character constellation with particular consideration of homosexuality. A later partly abridged translation by Richard S. Baldwin, which was published by the American Federation of Astrologers in 1978, rendered it much more loosely as homosexuality in the horoscope, but this translation omits the main part of the original title, which alludes to the organization of the human personality in general, an organization that Heimsoth holds to be fixed at birth. In his preface, Heimsoth declares that he has written the book from what he has gleaned in his practices of both psychoanalysis and astrology, and that it is intended for the use of practitioners of both disciplines. Echoing the views of Schwarzner, of whose work he later shows awareness in quoting one of the French astrologer's other remarks, Heimsoth expresses a need to seek an objective formulation for the psychological side of character analysis, and opines that this can be provided by a scientific astrology. He declares his aim to establish a connection between psychoanalysis and astrology, one that would make astrology useful to psychoanalysis and psychoanalysis useful to astrology. Again, we find much in common here with Schwarzner's views as published in 1908 on the benefits of fusing the two disciplines. Heimsoth states, page 11, that he has selected a focus on indications of homosexuality in support of his aim with the work as a whole, because it is a phenomenon that is poorly scientifically understood, and therefore implicitly a good candidate for elucidation by horoscope analysis. He adds that the views of Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Stekel, a follower of Sigmund Freud, come closest to his understanding on this subject. Referencing the psychoanalytical theories of German psychiatrist Ernst Kretschmer, 1888 to 1964, Heimsoth links some of Kretschmer's psychological types with the sign types elucidated by Oskar Schmitz in Der Geist der Astrologie, whose publication date Heimsoth mistakenly gives as 1916, 6 years before the first edition. Although judging that Schmitz's book is no more than an introduction to astrology, Heimsoth praises its author's psychological portrayals of the sign types, calling them the best he knows. Yet it is curious that whereas Schmitz went on to become a Jungian analyst, Heimsoth was here linking Schmitz's astrological sign types with the psychological types of another prominent psychologist altogether, in the form of Ernst Kretschmer. This choice exemplifies the diversity of influential thinkers within psychology itself in the late 1920s, and shows that although more and more astrologers wanted to connect astrology to modern psychology, there was not yet any kind of consensus around a preference for Jung. In Chapter 5, Heimsoth analyzes the birth charts of 30 homosexual individuals to try to deduce signature patterns among them. It is beyond the purposes of this talk to go into any detail on his findings. What is historically important to note is that Heimsoth was taking up the challenge laid down by Schwarzner 20 years earlier in attempting to fuse astrology with psychology, and going about it as a fully medically qualified practicing professional psychoanalyst himself, with all the knowledge that brought to bear on relevant theory. At the same time, Heimsoth was ostensibly not taking a Jungian approach in this at all. Source 12. Sorry, I need to go back one. That's it. Walter H. Sampson, The Zodiac, a Life Epitome, being a comparison of the zodiacal elements with life principles, cosmic, anthropologic, and psychologic, 1928. Walter H. Sampson's book, although published in 1928, was first conceived in 1920 as he completed a series of talks he had begun in 1919 on the symbolism of the zodiac. Not content with the extent of his research by the time of the completion of those talks in 1920, he aimed to seek out and incorporate material from further sources, and the result was a book of 420 pages, nearly all of which are given over to a lengthy exposition of the zodiac signs. The dating of the preface to 1926 suggests that the book was ready for press over a year before it was finally published. As promised by the title, there are periodic allusions to psychological readings of the signs and their groupings in the text. For instance, we find the first 4 signs, Aries to Cancer, linked by Sampson to the subconscious, the next 4, Leo to Scorpio, to the conscious, and the last 4, Sagittarius to Pisces, to the superconscious. In this latter regard, Sampson cites Jung, showing that he, at least, is a follower. Page 9. Psychoanalytically, research is making its way into this hitherto, as I believe, uncharted territory of the superconscious. The zodiac brings to bear proof of the actual existence of a tangible basis for man's higher relations, aspirations, and ideals, although it has been the habit largely to deride them. They can be shown not only practical, but as even destructive when not appreciated and utilized. The work of Professor Jung reaches constantly out in this direction. This voluminous book is emphatically not a sun sign guide, and nor does it make any attempt to correlate the signs with modern theories of psychological types as defined by psychologists themselves. Rather, it aims to bring out the essence of the zodiac signs in terms of their motive forces and observed psychological characteristics, with a fair measure of myth and Bible lore stirred in for illustrative good measure. One gets the feeling from this combination that it may have been popular among the large number of followers of theosophy still active in the UK in its day, in spite of the more modern allusions to psychological theory. The expansive writing style and inclusion of some mystical and abstract philosophical elements are also somewhat reminiscent of Dane Rudhyar's later writings. Source 13. Herbert von Klöckler, Berufsbegabung und Berufsschicksal, Astropsychologie der Berufsbegabung, 1928. This book, one of several notable astrological books by Herbert von Klöckler, but the only one to have been favoured with a translation into English, is expressly focused on the astropsychology of professional aptitude. This element of the title, by one of the foremost German astrologers of the early 20th century, exemplifies how widespread the term Astropsychologie had become in German astrological literature by 1928, which is presumed to stem significantly from its prominent use with a hyphen by Oskar Schmitz in his strong-selling, oft-reprinted book of 1922 that we discussed earlier. After Schmitz, we have seen further examples of its use by such authors as Lena Voss, as cited by Otto Kellner, which I have independently verified in my library copy of Voss's book, where it forms one of the major internal headings, and by Kellner himself. Schmitz had not just presented an obscure concept that nobody of any importance in the astrological world listened to. He had set in motion a general trend that had opened up a major new branch of German language astrological literature throughout the rest of the 1920s and indeed beyond. Like Kellner's book just a year earlier, von Klöckler's was published by the Astra Verlag of Leipzig. Von Klöckler reports in his foreword that the members of what he calls der Astrologischen Gesellschaft in Leipzig, the Leipzig Astrological Society, have contributed significantly to his writing of the book by collecting valuable material, by which we may reasonably infer relevant birth data. This is indicative of a cooperative astrological community in the Leipzig region at this time. The anonymous English translation was published by the American Federation of Astrologers in 1974 as Astrology and Vocational Aptitude. The author's introduction sets out an intellectual justification for the entire focus of the present book being on vocation, leaning on modern psychology in arguing that the desire for power is fundamental to human nature and is best expressed in the life's work, which will be assured of success only if the work is undertaken in a field compatible with the individual's innate aptitudes. He observes that the psychological profession is itself actively concerned with devising methods for personality evaluation with a view to helping people choose a suitable profession. But he decries the trendy field of psychotechnique, which has been loosely translated as industrial psychology, as being too crude to be of value for anything beyond manual and physical occupations, and as lacking the subtlety needed to assess ability for intellectually demanding professions. Von Klöckler partially acknowledges the usefulness of the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud and the Austrian psychotherapist Alfred Adler towards the understanding of the inner life of the individual, but states that they are too oriented towards concerns of psychopathology or mental illness to be of use in the evaluation of vocational aptitude. In this light, he contrasts, page 11, what he perceives as the limitations of modern psychology when it comes to evaluating the personality as a whole with the ability of newly consolidated forms of serious scientific astrology to achieve this. It is historically remarkable that in 1928, such relatively young German intellectuals as von Klöckler were expressing misgivings regarding modern psychology on account of its perceived limited ability to evaluate human personality in comparison with modern astrology as reformulated in a scientific spirit. And yet the inclusion of Astropsychologia in the very title of this book by von Klöckler shows that he had accepted the value of psychological study, only he clearly felt that modern astrology provided a clearer depiction of individual psychology than even the most prominent psychological theorists had achieved by themselves. Another point of note here is von Klöckler's selection of only Freud and Adler as the most notable psychologists. These are not the same authorities or influences as were picked out by Heimsoth, who leant primarily on Ernst Kretschmer in his book published in the same year. But we must acknowledge that in neither case does Carl Jung even figure. This further demonstrates that psychological astrology was being developed entirely independently of Jung's influence in the late 1920s, even by astrologers who spoke his native German, and that to the extent that astrologers felt the need to incorporate theories from modern psychology into their work at all, when using natal astrology as a character reading tool, as they had increasingly been doing since the late 19th century in any case, the cultural background in which psychology had risen to prominence was enough by itself to stimulate this, irrespective of which psychologists, theorists, each contributing astrologer had read. The book proper begins with a chapter headed Allgemeine Vorbemerkungen, General Preliminary Remarks. The first element here is a presentation of von Klerkler's own theory of personality types with respect to the question of occupation, introduced as Persönlichkeitstypen in der Berufsfrage. This is a purely psychological theory that divides people into 5 types to differentiate how they should be approached in any vocational consultation setting. The author then sets out guidelines for the psychological reading of the natal horoscope as a whole, with reference to dominant factors and a whole array of different types of structural elements that he classifies as belonging to either general structure or individual structure. These structural elements notably include such considerations as hemisphere analysis and the variable distribution of planets, anticipating the later work on chart types or planetary patterns by Mark Edmund Jones. Von Klerkler summarizes his chart reading technique in these terms, page 21. Die für die Berufsdiagnose bedeutsame Wesenssynthese aus dem Horoskop ergibt sich nun aus der Erfassung der Wechselspiele zwischen Struktur und Dominanz, wobei die Struktur die tieferliegenden, die Willkür entzogenen Seelenschichtungen vertritt, die sich durch die Dominante hindurch nach außen hin manifestieren wollen. This is saying that the synthesis of personal essence from the horoscope, which is significant for occupational diagnosis, arises from registering the interplay between structure and dominance, whereby the structure represents the deeper layers of the soul which want to manifest themselves outwards through the dominant factor. The rest of the book is a detailed examination of natal astrological indicators supporting different occupations. 19 distinct occupations are covered individually in detail and grouped by category into natural sciences, liberal arts, fine arts, and social professions. 2 other categories, business and trades, are instead considered as a whole and not subdivided. At the end, von Klerkler remarks that the birth chart can indicate not only professional suitedness, but also the likelihood of success within the chosen profession, with reference to the risks arising from any personality problems shown in the birth chart, such as carelessness, indiscretion, poor judgment, fear of conflict, or inferiority complexes. As a whole, the book presents as a thoroughly modern treatment of the question of vocational indicators and chances of success as manifest in the birth chart, interpreted through the lens of a holistic analysis of individual psychology. Source 14, Alan M. Emley, Solar Psychology, 1929. This American book, published in Denver, Colorado, essentially rebrands Hiram Butler's Solar Biology, which we discussed in the first talk, as Solar Psychology, while covering much the same ground 42 years later. The name has changed to suit the linguistic preferences of the times, but Butler's direct influence upon this work is acknowledged by Emley, and their approach to interpretation is very similar. Although Emley expresses, page 234, a wish to sift out the arcane esoteric philosophy from Butler's work, feeling that it was out of touch with present civilization. In the first chapter, page 12, Emley explains his conceptualization of solar psychology in these simple terms. Solar psychology means the study of mind as it is influenced by the solar system. It is notable here that Emley chooses to use the words is influenced by and not corresponds with or is symbolized by. This was in keeping with Butler's views of solar biology as a science. Emily expressly throws in his lot with the scientific worldview, stating, pages 18 to 19, "It is only as true scientists that we should begin the study of solar psychology. We should forget our prejudices and proceed with the idea of either proving or disproving such claims as are made in the book. It is only by studying people that we can gain a practical knowledge of this science." The astrologically interpretative content of the book is chiefly limited to the 12 sun signs, the 144 sun and moon sign combinations, and the planets from Mercury to Uranus in the signs, closely following the structure established in Butler's book Solar Biology in 1887. Overall, Emily's book is not especially innovative, but it does illustrate the continuing direct influence of Butler's novel late 19th century approach to astrology upon other American astrologers more than 4 decades later. Source 16, Hans Stein, Charaktertypen, eine Einführung in die astrologisch-physiognomische Betrachtungsweise, 1930. Hans Stein's book, which was presented in a large card folder together with 21 illustrated cards representing the features of 9 planetary types and 12 sign types, exhibits a complex mixture of influences from the worlds of physiognomy, astrology, and psychology, as becomes clear from the bibliography on page 100. Stein cites the characterological works of Karl Hütter and Emil Peters, and popular author Ernst Isberner Haldane on palmistry. The psychologists whose books he references include Freud, Adler, and Kretschmer, all 3 of whom have been cited by earlier German astrological authors we have covered, and even the Austrian philosopher and gender theorist Otto Weiniger, but Jung is not even mentioned, which suggests that even as late as 1930, it was still uncommon for Jung to even figure among the psychologists whose works German-speaking astrologers seeking to develop astrology in the light of modern psychology had read. Yet Stein has read widely of modern German-speaking astrologers, including Schmitz, Kellner, von Klöckler, Karl Brandler-Pracht, Fritz Werler, and A. Frank Glan, as well as 3 we have seen referenced by others in this study, Hans Wolff, Friedrich Schwab, and Lena Voss. In his introduction, Stein describes the book as the product of his 6 years of research into physiognomy, astrology, and astrological physiognomy. After initially training in Hütter's method of character reading from physiognomy, he became acquainted with astrology and immediately began researching the relationships between zodiac signs, planets, and types of human form and character. He declares his book as bringing a refinement of astrological physiognomy and a new kind of astrological psychological perspective. The main text, referencing each of the 21 illustrated cards in turn, then defines the 21 planetary and zodiacal types at length, primarily from a psychological perspective. Some further theoretical chapters follow before the book ends with extensive tables of correspondences between the sign types and a host of other considerations. This book, much like that of Kellner, represents a complex intermediate phase in the move towards a more modern psychological astrology, a phase that resembles a chaotic melting pot of influences from different disciplines with varying degrees of credibility to modern science. At the same time as adopting psychologists' language of types and showing learning from multiple eminent psychologists, Stein integrates into his system of astrological character types the practice of character reading from physiognomy at a time when this was still a highly popular discipline in its own right, at least in Germany. Source 16. Adolf Ferrier and Karl Ernst Kraft. Caractérologie typocosmique. Cadre synthétique pour l'étude des types psychologiques, la compréhension de l'individualité et l'éducation des enfants et des adultes, 1932. This volume, the early fruit of collaboration between Swiss statistician and astrological researcher Karl Ernst Kraft and his compatriot Adolphe Ferrier, 1879 to 1960, an academic with a doctorate in sociology, was jointly published in Geneva and Paris. It is a slim work of barely 55 pages and has become very scarce, but is exceedingly important to our historical narrative. The title translates as Typocosmic Characterology, a synthetic framework for the study of psychological types, the understanding of individuality, and the education of children and adults. Ferrier and Kraft had been mutually acquainted at least since 1926, but it was in 1929 that their collaboration deepened when Ferrier presided over a section of an education conference held in Denmark, for which section Kraft gave a number of talks that had deeply impressed Ferrier, following which they appear to have co-founded a Commission Permanente de Psychologie Individuelle et de Typologie, or at least it was founded with or without others, and as of 1932, Ferrier was the president and Kraft the secretary. This same commission is formally the publisher of the present book. Under Kraft's influence, Ferrier had started to diversify his interests into the domain of astrological research, ostensibly persuaded by Kraft that the statistical study of astrology could shed light on human psychology. But long before they met, Ferrier was an enthusiastic theorist in the domain of pure psychology and had conducted his own research into psychological types. In 1905, Ferrier had proposed three basic psychological types: the imitative or conventional type, the intuitive type, and the reflective or rational type. To these he added a fourth, the sensory or primitive type, in 1912, and this material was sketched out in the 7th chapter of his published 1915 book, Loi du progrès de biologie et en sociologie. Since 1925, Ferrier had come upon several other systems of psychological types that had been set out by other psychologists since the genesis of his own system. Perhaps under the influence of the first of those other systems that he encountered, in 1927 he subdivided his existing system of 4 types to give 12. While recounting this history in the pages of this volume, Ferrier cites 4 psychologists whose systems he had become aware of since 1925 and that he had taken into account in adapting his own system, of whom one is none other than Carl Jung. This is one of the earliest mentions of Jung we had found in any continental European astrology book, meeting the search criteria that we used in the present study, even allowing for the fact that Oskar Schmitz was already aware of some of Jung's work by 1922. Given that Jung's Psychologische Typen was first published in 1921, it would seem highly likely that the first of the other systems of psychological types that Ferrier encountered starting in 1925 was none other than that of Jung. However, it would amount to a grave historical misreading of the evidence if we were to assert that Ferrier's mention of Jung's psychological types in the pages of this book proved that Jung in particular had become a major influence on French-speaking astrologers by 1932. For we must remember that Ferrier had thitherto been only an academic sociologist by profession and not an astrologer, besides which he was Swiss as too was Jung, making it much more likely that Jung's work would have come to Ferrier's attention than to the notice of most French-speaking astrologers at an early stage, through the grapevine of relevant academic literature, as well as quite possibly conferences in their respective subject areas. What is more, Jung is only one of 4 other theorists of psychological types whose work in this area is mentioned by Ferrier here as having come to his attention since 1925. Alongside Jung, and given equal billing to him within Ferrier's autobiographical account, are French psychoanalyst René Allendy, 1889 to 1942, French doctor Paul Carton, 1875 to 1947, and an authority we have found cited earlier by 3 different German astrologers in this study, German psychiatrist Ernst Kretschmer. Ferrier's case further demonstrates the multiplicity of highly regarded authorities within psychology in general, and even within the specific domain of psychological typology at this point in time. Though becoming increasingly known, Jung did not yet stand out as being exceptional or preeminent within his field to most of the writers we have come across so far, if they had even read him at all, which was manifestly not the case for many astrologers of this period, since the ones who had cited psychologists by name had nearly all cited others and omitted to mention Jung. Even from the perspective of a fellow Swiss academic working in the closely related field of sociology, Jung was just one authority among 3 others. The main content of the book, Caractérologie typocosmique, presents as a disparate collection of loosely related essays by the respective co-authors on diverse themes, of which the longest, Typocosmie, spanning 22 pages, is authored by Kraft, who defines the term typocosmie as le système des archétypes qui constitue la base du monde, the system of archetypes that form the basis of the world. This essay is partly a philosophical exploration of what is meant by archetypes in general, and seeks, for example, to distinguish between the meaning of symbols and signs. Kraft remarks that since about 10 years ago, typological attempts have been made in the domains of anthropology, medicine, and psychology. He names German psychologist Eduard Spranger, 1882 to 1963, jointly with Jung and with Ferrier himself, as examples of authorities within the psychological category of typological theorists, whereas Kretschmer is placed together with 2 others in the medical category. It may or may not have been a knowing joke of Kraft's to have devised a system of 3 types of typologists in illustrating developments in this area of theory, but as a whole, this is a serious philosophical intellectual essay. In the final part of it, Kraft declares that for any system of archetypes to make sense, they must form in their totality a cycle starting with the origin of a phenomenon, passing through the appearance of that thing in the visible world, taking in its differentiation and development, and finishing with its reintegration or disappearance from the frame of our perception. With this in mind, he sets out a system of 7 archetypes that he calls, literally translated, origin, condensation, analysis, association, synthesis, and the medium, which he explains as comprising the totality of the conditions and circumstances that allow the other 6 archetypes to manifest. Kraft then superimposes the planets onto this system. In this order, Uranus, Saturn, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Neptune on the outside, and Mercury fulfilling the role of the medium in the middle. Each planetary archetype thus depicted is discussed in considerable detail and finally summarized with 3 keywords as part of a diagram. The details are beyond the scope of this presentation. It is enough for us to recognize that Kraft was attempting to devise his own reasoned and coherent system of planetary typology here. Among the references in the footnotes to his essay are no fewer than 3 works by Jung: Psychologische Typen, 1921, Die Beziehungen zwischen dem Ich und dem Unbewussten, 28, which would later be translated into English as The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, and Seelenprobleme der Gegenwart, 1931, which would later be translated into English as Modern Man in Search of a Soul. 1931, that was, sorry. These references show that Kraft, for his part, was taking a serious interest in Jung's work by 1932, including his very recent writings, although Jung was far from being his only source of inspiration from the world of psychology. Within the fifth essay, Les Types Psychologiques, which is by Ferrier, we find the older Swiss sociologist arguing that Kraft's new system of 7 planetary archetypes does not contradict his own older system of 12 psychological types, and indeed shows considerable correspondence with it, before calling for further research to be carried out. He wishes to emphasize that the present book is a preliminary publication of the early fruits of the two co-authors' joint research. Both of them would indeed go on to write lengthier books, taking their ideas introduced here much further. Source 17. Gustave Lambert-Brahy. Contribution à l'étude de l'astrodynamique. Cours synthétique d'astrologie scientifique. Exposé d'une méthode naturelle d'étude et d'interprétation des relations qui existent entre un ciel de naissance, le caractère d'un individu et le déroulement de sa destinée. 1932. Gustave Lambert-Brahy was the leading French-speaking Belgian astrologer of the 20th century. In the foreword to this book, which was limited to 400 copies, he states his aim as being to set out a new synthetic method of natal astrological interpretation that pairs everything back to a set of keys or symbols. This method is set out chiefly in the second part of the book headed L'Interprétation. For present purposes, we shall pass over the rest of the book, which sets out various more traditional considerations, such as the judgment of health, as well as covering astrological forecasting methods. Within the relevant second part, in Chapter 3, Les Planètes, the meanings of the signs are indeed pared down to a keyword-based format within a single-page table, page 29, with columns headed Signification, meanings, and Résultat, results, display 3 keywords apiece for each sign, nearly all of them relating to psychological characteristics or concepts. In Chapter 4, L'interprétation des signes et des planètes, the planets too are reduced to lists of psychological and conceptual keywords. For example, for Saturn, page 32, we find crystallization, reflection, hesitation, restriction, and pessimism. Brahe further argues that the 3 essential components of the conventional planetary glyphs have psychological correspondences: the cross to instinct, the crescent to desire, and the circle to reason. In Chapter 5, Des Aspects, the general meaning of aspects between every possible luminary and planetary pairing in the birth chart, irrespective of the type of aspect, is tabulated, with each planetary combination being granted 3 keywords. In Chapter 7, Les Maisons, the houses, Brahe contrasts the reading of the houses from those of the signs and planets, page 54, by stating that the signs indicate the psychological and moral tone, and the planets provide the mental and intellectual note, whereas the houses ensure the distribution of the influences in the material world. Brahe's readings of the houses are thus relatively conventional, but he attempts to account for each of them in terms of a unifying psychological principle. Thus, for example, the second house is read as the power of fixation, acquisition, and preservation, while the third house is read as the means of expression, creation, transmission, and communication. Thus, Brahe has psychologized even the terrestrial houses. In Chapter 8, Les planètes dans les maisons, the planets in the houses, we find a 2-page table in which each of the luminaries and planets as far as Neptune are read in each of the houses in terms of between 1 and 3 keywords or key phrases. Brahe gives no indication of having lent on any particular psychological authority, but his aim with this work was clearly to reform the understanding of the inner workings of the birth chart by reducing its elements to essential psychological principles that can then be synthetically combined in a logical fashion, instead of the astrologer needing to rely blindly on tradition. The challenge he set himself is therefore similar to the one Alan Leo set for himself when developing his system of esoteric astrology. But unlike Leo's work, Brahe's is clear to follow for the theosophically uninitiated and seems rooted much more in observational psychology and much less in abstract spiritual theory. Brahe's book was not the first keyword-based primer of natal astrology. Manly P. Hall's Astrological Keywords was first published in 1929 in a ring binder and reached its first book edition in 1931. But Brahe's was the first such work to expressly set out within the terms of its extended title to show how to delineate character using such a system in application to all the essential elements of the birth chart. Source 18, Karl Enzkraft again. Typikos mir über Urbilder und Sinnzeichen und ihre Einordnung zum Lebenskreis. Kosmologische Symbole im Wandel der Zeiten. From Welten des Sprachgeistes, 1934. This was Kraft's second original book to be published in German, but his first taking up the theme of Typikos mir that he had earlier written on in French as Typikos me. The title translates as Typokosmi, on archetypes and symbols and their classification within the life cycle, cosmological symbols in the course of time, on the workings of the spirit of language. In his introduction, page 1, Kraft advances a slightly different definition of typokosmia from the one he gave to its French equivalent in 1932. Kunde von Urbilden und ihren Wechselspielen, von Sinnzeichen und ihre Ordnungen, which means knowledge of archetypes and their interplay, of symbols and their orders. Earlier in the volume, Kraft gives detailed readings of the meaning of the planetary glyphs based on the consideration of their component elements, an exercise previously undertaken by Brahe, as we saw in Brahe's book of 1932. He also later explores variant early glyphs for Uranus, Saturn, Mars, and Neptune and their symbolic implications. Kraft reiterates within this book his scheme of 7 planetary archetypes that he first introduced in Caractérologie typocosmique, relating it to the 6-fold primordial unfolding of forces through a common center, which is Mercury. He subsequently tries to intellectually incorporate the 12-fold division of the zodiac into his archetypal blueprint, drawing up some decidedly unconventional correspondences between the signs and the planets in the process. For example, connecting Aries with Uranus, Cancer with Jupiter, Leo with Mars, Virgo with the Earth, Scorpio with Uranus, Sagittarius with Mercury, Aquarius with Neptune, and Pisces with the Sun. Only Taurus, Gemini, Libra, and Capricorn are paired with their conventional domicile rulers in this scheme. But it is also completely unlike Alice Bailey's scheme of esoteric astrological sign rulerships. Kraft then details his reading of the psychological manifestations of the 12 sign archetypes, some of which read as remarkably abstract and spiritually focused. For example, for Capricorn, we find words to the effect of yearning to overcome the consciousness of the self, the knowledge of one's own existence, of differences and hierarchies, the aspired to withdrawal of the ultimate will to live from all form and shape, of the outer as well as the inner living space, utter isolation, the disembodiment of the self, immersion in the unconditional, the birth pangs of the God-man. In the centre of the book, we find a detailed double-page table headed with words to the effect of the typocosmic life cycle in comparison with the zodiac of astrological tradition, data from mythology and contemporary typology research. One column within this table presents justifications from mythology, and even in one case from Sanskrit, for the unconventional assignments of planets to signs by Kraft. This reasoning from myth presents the thinking by 1934 of Kraft, whose historical reputation within astrology is primarily one of a hard statistical scientist, as being compatible in some respects with that of much later Jungian psychological astrologers such as Liz Green, in whose work mythological allusions abound in the exploration of the planetary and sign archetypes. The two final columns of Kraft's great table also bear close analysis. They are collectively headed Psychologische Hauptfunktion, meaning main psychological function. The first is subheaded Theoretische by reinen Vertretern, meaning theoretically by pure representatives. The second is then subheaded Entspricht etwa bei Jung, meaning corresponds roughly to Jung. Thus, Kraft is presenting two differential psychological interpretations of each sign archetype, with the first seeming to be closer to his own view, and the second rounded up to the language of Jung. In several cases, they are almost exactly the same, but his own view is more detailed. We do not have time to fully detail Kraft's correspondences with Jung's types here, but each of them includes either the term extravertierte, extroverted, or the term introvertierte, introverted, in combination with either Empfindung, sensation, Denken, thought, Fühlen, feeling, or Intuition, intuition, but with some variation to distinguish signs conferred the same basic combination of terms from each other, as was needed to avoid exact replication when there were just 8 Jungian psychological types but 12 signs. It is noteworthy that in 1934, 2 years before the first publication of Dane Rudhyar's The Astrology of Personality, Kraft had already directly mapped Jung's psychological types onto the 12 signs as part of his own attempt to integrate a typological doctrine into astrology. Towards the end of the volume, we find the promised focus on the spirit of language, and in this regard, Kraft notably attempts to present new perspectives on the names of the planets. Source 19, Dr. Bretéché, Astrologie psychologique et médicale, fascicule 1, Étude statique, 1935. Dr. Bretéché is the last of our authors to present as a doctor of medicine who has written a book alluding to psychological astrology before 1936. He is described on the front cover of his book as a former hospital intern who has also formerly directed a surgical clinic. This is the only French work found prior to 1936 to include the exact expression astrologie psychologique in its very title, but its presence there demonstrates that the concept of psychological astrology was becoming normalized among modern French astrological researchers and authors by this time. And whereas Paul Choisnard, who was by now deceased, had introduced the term psychologie astrale in 1908 and stuck to it thereafter, astrologie psychologique reads as a direct translation of the equivalent English language expression psychological astrology that had already been established by Charles Carter, among others, over a decade earlier. In his introduction, Dr. Bretéché praises the advances made in the direction of establishing astrology more scientifically, and singles out Schwarzenau for recognition on account of his work in that direction. Perhaps surprisingly, within the main content of the book, he gives a detailed exposition of the meanings of the four ancient Hippocratic temperaments: le bilieux, le nerveux, le sanguin, and le lymphatique. These, together with a fifth he calls le digestif and grants to the sun, are then connected, based on the doctor's working experience, to the influence of the seven anciently known planets, with the lymphatic temperament rather oddly being assigned to the Earth. Dr. Bretéché connects Jupiter, Saturn, and the Moon to hybrids of two temperaments each. The next part of the book is dedicated to the study of psychopathology. The author first gives an account from a psychiatric perspective of a host of different classes of conventionally recognized psychopathological syndromes, including psychasthenia, mania, melancholy, paranoia, and mythomania. Then he details 140 astrological case studies from his notes, giving their birth date, identifying their dominant planets, and summarizing their psychiatric conditions. The chapter headed Les Types Planétaires then explores 7 planetary temperaments, this time excluding the Earth, in detail, attempting to identify their characteristic affective dispositions and intellectual faculties, as well as the corresponding bodily morphology and tendencies to pathology. After first remarking, page 71, that each dominant planet corresponds to a very specific mentality whose tendency towards a given form of psychosis is known. Bretéché expresses his view that cosmic radiations alone determine the whole of the innate personality, including the instincts, the salient features of the character, and the structure of the intellect. Each of the 7 planetary types is given between 5 and 7 dense pages of text. When this is complete, the doctor then gives detailed typological readings of planetary combinations, taking in all planetary pairings composed of the planets from Sun to Saturn, with the notable additional inclusion of a triple planet combination for the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, testifying to his awareness of the fairly common occurrence of their triple conjunction. There is no manifest consideration of the signs or the houses in this book, but it was intended as the first installment in a series, and we can only guess how Dr. Bretéché may have been planning to develop his study further, if only further parts of it had been published. In practice, this was the only one to see the light of day. Nonetheless, in this one installment that was published, Dr. Bretéché has set out a highly detailed study of planetary psychological typology, at the same time as showing significant researches on the correspondences between natal astrology and diverse specific forms of mental illness. It is the third dossier on psychiatric correlates with astrology that we have encountered before 1936, following on from the limited set of case studies presented by the anonymous A Mental Specialist and the selective research reports of Carl Günther Heimsoth. Collectively, they demonstrate that at least 3 doctors with knowledge of psychiatry, each speaking a different primary language, had published astrological research related to mental illness in book form more than 35 years before the publication in 1972 of the book Astropsychiatry by Harry F. Darling and Ruth Hale Oliver. Lastly, source 20, Henri Condiani, Astrological Aphorisms and Divination, and you can see the full subtitle on your screen, which I won't read out. 1936 is the estimated date of the translation, but the French original was from 1935, and therefore the material predates Rudhyar's book of the following year. This short book by the otherwise little-known astrologer Henri Candiani was first published in the original French in 1935 as Aphorismes sur l'astrologie et la divination. But an English translation followed very quickly in 1936, published by Hélène Fowler, and it is to this that we refer to today's purposes in the absence of access to the French original. It is a work seeking to concisely but clearly expound a modern philosophy of astrology, not a primer of interpretation. Despite the focus on divination implied by the title, Candiani's philosophy of astrology follows a causal model of astral influence, which marks it out in sharp relief from the later views of Geoffrey Cornelius, and explains the mention of astropsychological determinism in the subtitle. For Candiani, there is no contradiction between causal determinism and the adoption of a psychologically mediated understanding of how astrology works. On the contrary, they fit together perfectly in his astrological worldview. In his introduction to the book, Candiani sings the praises of recent advances in modern astrology, arguing, page 9, that modern astrologers have applied clinical, psychological, and statistical methods to systematically verify their science. In this regard, he cites Choisnard, Kraft, and Brahe, works by all of whom we have covered earlier, as authors of particular note, alongside also Henri Selvat, who, alongside his work on the astrology of Jean-Baptiste Morin, was also a pioneer in statistical astrological research, to which end he cooperated significantly with Choisnard in the very early 1900s. Candiani predicts that the consideration of these works by the officials will entail the complete rehabilitation of astrology. What is notable here is that the statistical and psychological methods are being held up by Candiani in the same breath as joint contributors to the rehabilitation of astrology and its reputation, as though they are both equally important markers of modern scientific thinking. Within part B of the translated work, headed Astral Influxes, Human Influxes, and the Complex of Cassandra, we find a general psychological theory of how natal astrology affects each individual, one that references the modern psychological concept of the unconscious. Page 47. The astral potentialities fixed in the unconscious tend to express themselves in acts, or at least in conscious thought, much before their time of realization. They exercise pressure, often violent, towards consciousness, which they tend to invade. They are usually thrust back more or less completely, and then form a complex analogous to those of the classic psychoanalysis. We shall call it the complex of Cassandra. There is no attempt within Candiani's book to classify psychological types with reference to elements used in astrological interpretation. It is limited in its focus to presenting a guiding framework for understanding how astrological influences in general psychologically affect individuals and their behavior. So this has been Lecture 2 of Early Developments Towards Modern Psychological Astrology. It was brought to you thanks to the Astrological Association. And if you stay tuned into In the Loop, there will be announcements about Lecture 3, work on which has yet to commence, but it's provisionally anticipated for July 2026 and will be called Psychological Astrology in the Era of Dane Rudhyar, an examination of primary sources from 1936 to 1960, or possibly to an intermediate date before 1960, depending on how many sources of relevance need to be dealt with. We will now head back to Mary or whoever else is available for questions.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was absolutely fab. I think Rod's going to just remind us about the conference.
Oh, me? Okay, I thought you were going to say that. Anyway, who said that? It doesn't matter. Okay, so everyone, we're going to have a conference from the 17th of September to 20th of September. And this year we have a great lineup. Philip will be one of them. And then so this includes so many other astrologers, including Lynn Bell, Tony Howard, and I think Luisa, thank God from Portugal will join us. So please welcome to join us. And if you book before the 31st of May, you're going to have a big discount. So don't miss this chance. If you haven't booked yet, please book it. All right. And so go to AA website and click the conference and you can join us. Okay.
Thank you, Rod. We have got lots of questions in the chat. Philip, do you want to have a little read through and then you can choose the ones that you'd like to answer? And
As
Roy,
Mary
thank you very
just
much for
mentioned while
joining
he's
us.
thinking,
Yeah.
I think we actually did we decide a date for the next talk, by the way? I think we did
We
on the
provisionally
11th of
discussed
June.
one. It might have been the
Yeah.
11th. Yeah, sorry, I haven't got a
Yeah.
note about that. So I'm sure that's correct, though. But we will send out an announcement through in the loop closer to
Yeah,
the
it
time.
might be about then. So, but just to keep your eyes open very carefully because we want to see what happens next.
Okay, so Charlotte, you said which writer did you just quote talking about archetypes? Was that a concept which existed outside Jung's work? Well, I quoted multiple authors, but in particular at that stage, 2045, that was probably Karl Ernst Kraft, the Swiss statistical researcher who had multiple interests within astrology and who had previously collaborated with Adolphe Ferrier, the Swiss sociologist, who had himself developed his own system of psychological types before Jung developed his. So actually, that was quite an interesting bit of history in that certainly, well, psychological types existed outside Jung's work. What the exact distinction is between psychological types and archetypes, I'm not really an expert on psychology, so that's for somebody else to answer. But certainly Kraft was talking about that, but by that time, Kraft was citing Jung as one source among others.
Yeah, I think it was when you were talking about Ferrier, and I was specifically interested in the use of the term archetype because I had always understood that that was a term that Jung himself had coined, but I wouldn't want to put money on that. So I was just curious if you knew.
I don't have the answer to that immediately. I mean, it's possible that Jung came up with the specific word archetype, but that because he wasn't the only psychologist to develop a theory of psychological types, there were similar concepts around prior to that, but not specifically using the same word. That's a provisional assessment based on the evidence. We have this timeline that Ferrier came up with a system of psychological types first, and then he incorporated Jung's subsequently published system, among others, in subdividing that system of 4 types into 12. So that's as much as I know at the moment.
Yeah, but it's really brilliant that you're filling in all this contextual information. It makes the whole community, the whole atmosphere that was active at that time much clearer. So thank you.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Karen. How far do you think World War I, 1914 to 18, and the Spanish flu pandemic, 18 to 20, had any influence on the books that were published then or shortly afterwards, e.g., an emphasis on mental health?
That's a very good question. I hadn't even considered that yet. I mean, it sounds plausible in that there were a lot of people who were affected deeply by service in World War I who survived it and came back suffering from shell shock and other long-term damage to their psychological health. So it would seem quite plausible that there are simply more referrals for psychiatric treatment after that, and that therefore psychologists such as the three that we discussed, writing in different languages, were simply presented with more patients, and that may have been partly a stimulus to their research on astrological connections in that area. But I mean, I don't think by any means that they were representative of the psychiatric profession as a whole, in that there would have been many, many psychiatrists who never investigated astrology. But the fact that some did, to the extent of even writing whole books about it, suggests that there were others who did so without writing books about it, and therefore it wasn't as uncommon as all that.
Thank you. Kim's asked a question. Is archetype not significant because of its connection to the collective unconscious as distinct to personality types, which would be more about the subconscious?
I'm sure you're right about that, yes.
Super. We've got a lovely comment earlier on. This is from Melanie Reinhardt. She says, Dear Philip, thanks so much for all the work you've put into these webinars. So informative and interesting. Unique material, which is also assumption busting. Bravo.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you for attending both of the talks. I heard that you had been to the previous one from a friend, and that was just very, very heartening to know, because you're so respected in the community for all that the work on psychological astrology that you have done, both as a teacher and as an author. So thank you for even showing up, and your comments mean a lot. Thank you.
I hesitate to ask this question, but it's a more general one. But the influence of Jung, particularly, is so special at this time, and I was always thinking about it to the extent to which all these writers were drawing on his ideas, and the extent to which he was proactively involved in it. Now, we know that always say that his daughter was an astrologer, or even some people claim Jung was an astrologer. But I don't know if you have any sort of feeling in the extent, or any comment to make on the extent to which he was proactively an astrologer rather than a person with ideas that got related to astrology.
I mean, he is known to have done a certain amount of astrological research that was, I think, I don't have a copy of his Red Book, but when the Red Book was published around 15 years ago, I'm told by people who are specialist practitioners of astrological psychoanalysis that it included astrological comments of various kinds. And also, I think Liz Green covered some of that ground in her two-volume set of studies of Jung's relationship to astrology, which I think is probably still the best source for specifically exploring Jung's own relationship to astrology. Obviously, I'm coming from a very different premise, which is the relationship of astrologers to psychology. And because you're looking from a much broader view, you will then get a different perception from the perception you get when you come from a position of looking as Jung as your primary reference point, and then how he interacted with psychology. And I think the two views complement each other in effect.
Mm.
But Jung is known to also have written a certain amount of done a certain amount of statistical astrological research in the 1950s, or around the 1950s, which I read about a long time ago, in which his concept of synchronicity was popularized and spelt out in a lot more detail what he actually meant by it. I gather there was an earlier sort of primitive use of this concept by him decades earlier, but it wasn't really until the 1950s that it got its fullest exposition. So, you know, there's a lot to study in Jung's own work about that as well.
Thank you. It's quite Carol Winers said just that you'll see in the chat box that he took a correspondence course with Mac Heidel's Rosicrucian correspondence course. So he certainly wanted to know about astrology. We know that.
That's interesting. Well, Heindel's work, a lot of Heindel's books were translated into continental European languages. I know at least two of his books were translated into German and were widely available. So it doesn't entirely surprise me that a German-speaking psychologist such as Jung would have been familiar with Heindel's work because, as I say, it was widely available in German.
Mm.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah, I've just had a question about where's the first talk, as it's already on our YouTube channel. I've put the link in the chat, but if you're here this evening, you want to see the first talk, it is on our YouTube channel and it's listed under library talk. But I put the direct link on.
And they're all going to be, as we build them up, they're going to be more and more of these that are going to be referred to by many people over the years, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Are there any more questions that haven't been answered yet? Because I can't see them all here. But...
I think they've all been answered. There was a comment earlier. I'm surprised you mentioned so many German authors. I'm very impressed about the library and the work, and that was by Almut. He said that your German's very good. Yes, the other questions were about recordings. Yeah, which I've
An
answered.
appreciation of Philip's German pronunciation. Did you notice that in the
It's
chat?
very generous considering I only took it at the age of 16. And I do recognise I occasionally made mistakes, such as I said Schwab rather than probably should be Schwab with a more of a V sound, for instance. But it's just being in the moment and trying to read quite extensive passages. I do make occasional mistakes like that, unfortunately. But as long as it was comprehensible on the recording, that's the main thing, I hope.
Well, there's general acceptance, general admiration, all the same.
Oh, we've got one more message just coming in.
There's a question coming up.
Yes, brilliant. The inclusion of German and French sources. Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, Philip. Now, Vanessa's asked, what was that book that you mentioned called something like Astrological Psychiatry? And who was it by? It was near the beginning. That's a question from Vanessa.
Near the beginning. Well, I mentioned a much later English language book called Astropsychiatry by Harry F. Darling and Ruth Hale Oliver, which is probably quite commonly regarded as the first significant specialist work on the psychiatric, the relationship between astrology and psychiatric illness in English. However, because it actually includes the word psychiatry in its title, it stands out. But what this discussion, I hope, has shown is that it wasn't the first by any means, because there were other books with different elements in their title that were also written by psychiatrists much earlier in the 20th century and that sought to explore these connections through independent research by those psychiatrists. And then, of course, much later, there was also Signs of Mental Illness by Dr. Mitchell E. Gibson around the turn of the 21st century, or perhaps it was in the late 1990s. I don't know the exact publication date, but that's also a popular book nowadays.
Yeah, so if you have missed something from earlier on, just hop over to YouTube after it's been uploaded and you'll be able to see the things again that you might have missed. Yeah.
Okay.
I know it's been a long talk, so if nobody has any more questions, we should probably let everyone get to bed if they're in anywhere east of Greenwich, or get back to work if they're not. So whatever they like to do on Saturdays.
Thank you again, Philip. It's absolutely admiring to hear you give all this information. Thank you.
I hope it's been enlightening. I do hope that watching the recording again will help to clarify things, because I know that there's a lot to take in by each of these authors, and ultimately there's no substitute for having to hand copies of the original sources, and then you can see exactly what I was getting at.
I think Charlotte's got one more question. Oh, no. Oh, it was just a hand went up. Okay.
She's clapping.
Thank you very
Okay.
much, everybody, this evening. So thank you very much to Roy and to Rod and to Philip and Amanda, who is with us as well, and to everybody for coming this evening.
And keep your eye on In the Loop, because if it isn't going to be the 11th of July, it will be soon, that around that time, and that will be an even more up-to-date summary. So look out for that.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.